This is Pacifica Radio's Letters and Politics. On today's show,
This notion of an all-powerful president when it comes to military matters simply continued through the administrations of the elder Bush, Clinton, the younger Bush, and Barack Obama. It's only when we have this impulsive president that we have now that I think people are awakening to how foolish this distribution of war powers has been.
A conversation about presidential power and war. Our guest is Andrew Bacevich. Andrew Bacevich is a retired Army colonel and author of a number of books. His latest is called The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory. Andrew Bacevich joins us next on Letters and Politics. But first, the news.
For Pacifica Radio, I'm Eileen Alfandary. New Jersey Senator Cory Booker has dropped out of the Democratic presidential race. He announced his departure in a video.
So now I recommit myself to the work. I can't wait to get back on the campaign trail and campaign as hard as I can for whoever is the eventual nominee and for candidates up and down the ballot.
Booker's departure leaves one African-American long-shot candidate in the Democratic race, former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick. California Senator Kamala Harris dropped out last month. Julian Castro, who'd been the only Latino in the race, dropped out earlier this month. The only remaining candidate of color who has met criteria to participate in the debates is entrepreneur Andrew Yang. Yang and 5 others will share the debate stage in Iowa tomorrow night. Also on stage will be Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Joe Biden, and Bay Area billionaire Tom Steyer. Steve Phillips, founder of the group Democracy in Color, said after Booker's announcement that the reality is the primary process privileges white men above everyone else at the expense of the party space. He said the white candidates remaining in the race should commit now to having a ticket that reflects the racial and gender diversity of the new American majority. Online video shows Iranian security forces firing both live ammunition and tear gas to disperse demonstrators protesting Iran's downing last week of a Ukrainian jetliner, killing all 176 people aboard. Tehran's police chief later denied his officers fired live rounds, although did admit to the tear gas. Today marked the third day of protests on the streets of the capital after the Revolutionary Guard admitted it mistakenly shot down the Ukrainian jetliner, saying it thought the plane was an incoming U.S. cruise missile. Iranian authorities at first had denied responsibility. Family members of those killed denounced the government.
We gathered here because of some Iranian leaders' inefficiency, because of some people's inadequacy. Our children were killed in the sky. That's why we gathered together here. Where do we go?
57 of the dead were Canadians. Iran has approved visas for experts from the Canadian Transportation Safety Board and others. The chief executive of the Canadian company Maple Leaf Foods, meanwhile, directly blamed President Trump for the death of an employee's wife and family aboard the doomed aircraft. CEO Michael McCain called Trump that narcissist in Washington and said the dead Canadians are collateral damage. In an apparent reference to Trump's impeachment, McCain tweeted that, quote, U.S. government leaders unconstrained by checks and balances concocted an ill-conceived plan to divert focus from political woes. He added, we are mourning and I am livid. President Trump says the Senate should simply dismiss the impeachment case against him. He says to hold the trial would give credibility to the charges against him. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is expected to announce when she'll send the impeachment articles to the Senate after meeting tomorrow with other Democratic lawmakers. She spoke to ABC.
I've always said I would send them over, so there shouldn't be any mystery to that. What we did want, though, and we think we accomplished in the past few weeks, is that we wanted the public to see the need for witnesses with firsthand knowledge of what happened, documentation, which the president has prevented from coming to the Congress as we review this.
At least one Republican up for re-election, Senator Susan Collins of Maine, said last week she was in talks with Republican colleagues on a process that would allow them to hear testimony as Democrats want. A group of homeless Oakland mothers who took over a vacant house owned by an investment firm is bracing for eviction. A crowd of supporters turned out early this morning to surround the house the mothers and their children have been living in for the past 2 months. The mothers say they'll brave arrest, and they have supporters who say they will too.
Housing is a human right that everybody should have access to. And so that's why I'm here today, because they moved me to action, and I just couldn't sit down and just watch them take all the flack. We're engaged in nonviolent, peaceful, civil disobedience, right? And all of us here are willing to take arrests for this movement.
The investment firm Wedgwood, which owns the vacant home and many others, says it won't negotiate with the Oakland Land Trust, which has offered to buy the house for the mothers so long as the mothers remain inside. Instead, over the weekend, Wedgwood offered to pay Catholic charities to house the mothers for 2 months while they look for another place to live. One of the mothers, Dominique Walker, responded, quote, "It is deeply disingenuous for this multi-million-dollar corporation through their multi-million-dollar public relations firm to pretend to be concerned about the well-being of Black families." I'm Eileen Alfandary. Letters and Politics is next.
Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Before we get to our conversation with Andrew Bacevich, author of the book The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory, I want to give you an update on the impeachment process in Congress. Democratic Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi of San Francisco, says that the House will send the 2 articles of impeachment against President Donald Trump to the Senate this week, meaning that an impeachment trial in the Senate could begin by the end of the week. Speaker Pelosi says that she will consult with her Democratic caucus tomorrow morning on how to move forward. She had been holding on to the 2 articles of impeachment and trying to force Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell of Kentucky to conduct what she considers to be a fair and legitimate trial of the president, which would include calling witnesses who refused to testify in the House impeachment inquiry. People like White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, former National Security Advisor John Bolton, and Michael Duffy of the Office of Management and Budget. McConnell has suggested that the Senate will proceed as the Senate did in 1999 with the impeachment trial of President Bill Clinton. In that impeachment trial, there was 24 hours of oral arguments for both the prosecution and the defense, and an additional 12 hours set aside for questions from senators. The questions are read by the Chief Justice of the United States. That time it was Chief Justice William Rehnquist. And then after that process in 1999, after you had the 24 hours for each side, I believe, of oral arguments, and then the 12 hours of questions from senators, after that all happened, then the Senate took, which was more of a partisan vote, more of a contentious vote on whether or not to hear witnesses. And they did hear a couple of witnesses in that trial. Very likely that will be the process this time. Once the Senate begins its trial, we'll have several days, maybe even a couple of weeks of oral arguments, both from I say prosecution. The prosecution will be made up probably of Democratic members in the House of Representatives, about 4 or 5 people like Adam Schiff, chair of the House Intelligence Committee, Gerald Nadler, chair of the House Judiciary Committee. One possibility that there will be an independent member on that prosecutorial team, and that would be Justin Amash, who was a Republican, who left the party and actually voted for impeaching Donald Trump. There is a movement to try to get him as a part of that team. Maybe you get somebody like Jamie Raskin, Democrat of Maryland. In fact, I hope so. Jamie Raskin is a constitutional professor and has been very elegant and throughout this entire process and talking about the meaning of impeachment and what the framers meant about impeachment. And I thought has been one of the more fascinating people to listen to during this entire process. So after, again, the arguments are made and from the prosecutors and then Trump's defense team, you have 12 hours of questions from senators, I'm guessing, if the rules are still the same. And then the Senate will decide whether or not to hear from witnesses. Now, not all is lost for Nancy Pelosi's strategy here because, she has brought a tremendous amount of attention to the issue about witnesses. More damning information has come out as she has held on to these articles of information that show both the Office of Management and Budget and the Pentagon were extremely worried about not delivering the $391 million in military aid to Ukraine, which could be a violation of the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, and that one of the major orders to hold that money came just an hour and a half after Donald Trump had his conversation with Ukrainian President Zelensky, in which he indicated he wanted Ukraine to announce that it would be investigating the Bidens. Susan Collins, Republican senator from Maine, has said that she's trying to form a small group of Republican senators that would vote in support of having witnesses when you get to that point. And we'll have to see how that plays out. It'll depend who the witnesses are. Remember, Donald Trump wants, and Republicans want witnesses too. They want to hear from Hunter Biden, and they want to hear from the whistleblower. But if Susan Collins can get three other Republicans to join her, making four, and if all Democrats in the Senate are on board for having witnesses, those four Republicans would give you a majority for four witnesses. So not all is lost. It is possible that later in this process we will have witnesses testifying to the Senate. So this week, the trial is likely to begin, but we probably won't get into the heart of things until next week. There are a lot of procedural motions that have to be considered. The Senate has to vote on the rules for impeachment. Then John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, will serve and preside over the trial. And then John Roberts will have to swear in all 100 senators. Then, of course, the prosecution team and the defense team will have to prepare as well for the trial to begin. So, could be wrong on this, but there's a very good chance that the heart of the trial, when you finally get to the oral arguments, would begin after the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday this weekend. But we will see. It could begin before. Mitch McConnell has said also, like in 1999, the trial will occur 6 days a week. The only day there will not be a trial will be on Sunday, and that the trial will begin every day at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time or 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. The reason for that is that the Senate wants to leave some time in the morning to be able to work on other issues. One of those issues the Senate may want to work on and likely will work on is the war powers resolution that we're expecting to be brought by Democratic Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia. This is in response of President Donald Trump, ordering the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, a top general for Iran. The House of Representatives last week passed its own resolution in which it said that the president cannot strike Iran, militarily speaking, without congressional authority anymore. Well, Tim Kaine will have a similar measure, though different in some ways. The House measure was considered a concurrent resolution, which means it does not need the signature of the president. Tim Kaine's measure does need the president's signature and would need the House to pass it as well, because it's not the same measure that the House previously passed. And even if he gets the votes in order to get it passed throughout Congress, well, Donald Trump could veto actually his measure. And then you could try to override that veto, but very unlikely in Congress you'll have 2/3 majority to be able to do that. But that's one of the big things that the Senate may also work on, even while they are moving forward with an impeachment trial of President Donald Trump. Well, now we're going to get to the heart of today's show. We're going to sort of get more on this issue of war powers and how presidents over time have gained more and more power, and as Congress has conceded this power in conducting war and other avenues in government as well. But war and using the military and war powers is probably the most obvious example. For this conversation, I'm very happy to welcome back to this radio program Andrew Bacevich. Andrew Bacevich is Professor Emeritus of History and International Relations at Boston University. He is also chair of the Quincy Institute for Intelligent Statecraft. He is the author of a number of books, His latest is called The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory. We will be in conversation about that. Andrew Bacevich joins me via Skype. Andrew Bacevich, I thank you greatly for your time this morning.
I'm glad to be here.
Good to have you. I want to begin with something you write at the very beginning of your book, and it is a warning that came in 1987 from a senior advisor to former Soviet Union leader Mikhail Gorbachev. And this is the quote, "We are going to do a terrible thing to you. We are going to deprive you of an enemy." What's significant about that quote?
Well, it was very insightful on his part. Insightful in this sense is that I don't know if everybody in the Soviet leadership appreciated this, but it turned out to be true that the Cold War, at least in my estimation, provided an organizing principle for American society. The Cold War determined the way we saw the world, and it determined the way we defined our role in the world. And I think not ignoring the enormous errors that occurred during the Cold War. The Vietnam War being one example, the arms race leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis being another example. Notwithstanding those mistakes, to some degree, the Cold War protected us against our worst instincts. So when the Cold War ended, we were let loose on ourselves and on the world in ways that I argue in the book had very negative consequences.
So what are those instincts you're talking about that the Cold War helped control?
Well, let's take military power as an example. It was the Cold War that persuaded our political class, for the first time in our history, to maintain a very large peacetime military establishment. That's what really occurred in the late 1940s and early 1950s during the process of rearming to face the Soviet threat. Now, the purpose of that enormous military during the Cold War, the primary purpose, was to contain the Soviet Union, to deter the communists, to prevent war. Now, your listeners might say, hey, wait a second. There was Korea, there was Vietnam, there was the shenanigans of the CIA, all true. But I would still insist that the overarching rationale for maintaining enormous military power was to prevent World War III from happening. Cold War ends. Danger of World War III has now evaporated. And how do we respond? We respond by maintaining, declaring our intention to maintain in perpetuity enormous military power. But now, in important ways, the rationale for that military establishment changes. The principal rationale is no longer to contain or deter. The rationale becomes one of putting American military power to use, to bring about change where we think change is needed. So when you think about U.S. military history, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that history begins in December of 1989, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, with the intervention in Panama to bring about regime change in Panama. Begins there, but then continues through the succeeding administrations of Bill Clinton and George W. Bush and even Barack Obama, with this pattern of interventionism in matters large and small, the global, so-called global war on terrorism being the most prominent example, but by no means the only example. So in that sense, I'm arguing in the book that when the Cold War ended, we kind of just cut loose on military power. We decided we can do whatever we wanted to do. And I would argue that the consequences turned out to be highly negative.
That's interesting. We've been talking a lot of late about this idea of an imperial presidency that has evolved over time. We talked about the War Powers Act of 1973 and reaction to the killing of the Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. You think Panama, going back to the invasion of Panama, is something that set a new precedent?
Yes, I did. I think that it initiated a period of military activism that has continued down to the present moment, with the assassination of Soleimani really being only the latest example of that. But you were referencing war powers. I think that the war powers issue and the fact that the commander-in-chief exercises such broad prerogatives, as exemplified with the Soleimani assassination, that really dates all the way back to the beginning of the Cold War. The perceived danger of the Soviet Union, particularly after the Soviets acquired nuclear weapons, the perceived prospect, the possibility of a nuclear strike on the United States. So we're talking here late 1940s, early 1950s. Persuaded our political leadership at that moment to hand the commander-in-chief prerogatives related to the use of force that were unprecedented. You know, one of the great symbols of the Cold War, it seems to me, was the button. You know, that the president had his finger on the button. We empowered the president on his own authority to launch a massive nuclear attack against whatever adversary he chose to do so. Now, none made that choice. But here we are, 30 or so years after the Cold War, and only now, with this latest episode and with Trump in the White House, do we awaken to the fact that the president has acquired this enormous authority. Now people are saying, wait a second, how'd that happen? Well, it happened because the Congress forfeited its role in waging war, in declaring war. And now they're confused about how they can reclaim that authority.
Do you think that the giving, I guess this would begin with Harry Truman, getting to your point of the early Cold War of giving tremendous amount of power to the president, was so to still allow the space, allow the United States to act in certain ways, we can talk about what those certain ways were, while keeping out of an entire hot war with the Soviet Union directly?
Yes, that was the rationale. In other words, when we decided to hand over to the president this enormous power, it wasn't because the Congress was encouraging the president to launch World War III on his own ticket. It was with the expectation that the president shared with the Congress this determination to avoid a nuclear cataclysm. Again, this goes back to my previous argument that the overarching purpose of American military power was to prevent war, prevent World War III. So it seemed at that time to make sense. We can argue about whether or not it did make sense, but it seemed back in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and even the 80s, it seemed to make sense to allow the president to exercise this enormous authority. But when the Cold War ended, nobody stopped and said, hey, wait a second, maybe it's time for us to reallocate power when it came to war. This notion of an all-powerful president when it comes to military matters simply continued through the administrations of the elder Bush, Clinton, the younger Bush, and Barack Obama. It's only when we have this impulsive president that we have now that I think people are awakening to how foolish this distribution of war powers has been.
Yeah, I have thought to myself and even said outwardly on this program, I'm not sure if we had a more quote-unquote conventional president, even with the situation with Ukraine or the assassination of Soleimani, but really about Ukraine. I'm thinking of impeachment. I'm not sure a more conventional president would actually be impeached right now. But when you have somebody that is as unpredictable, perhaps, as this president, there's this growing recognition of, oh, this person has a tremendous amount of power. We don't trust him.
Yeah, and I think that the question ought to be asked. The question does not apply exclusively to Trump. I mean, let's recall the Obama administration. The Soleimani assassination was not the first assassination of a foreign leader. Obama assassinated a rather large number of targets that we perceive to be terrorists that threatened the United States. Recall that it was Obama who decided, without any congressional authority, that we were going to participate in overthrowing the Gaddafi regime in Libya. No particular vital U.S. interests involved there. The rationale was really a humanitarian one. And so we did succeed in overthrowing Gaddafi. Remember Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's famous dance in the end zone when she declared, we came, we saw, he died. With what result? I mean, basically, Libya has been in a state of chaos ever since. That was a war that was started at the whim of the commander-in-chief. So not for a second would I say anything in defense of Donald Trump on these matters. I think the Soleimani assassination was unbelievably reckless and misguided. But our problem is not Trump here. Our problem is the way that the Congress and elites more generally have allowed the Constitution to be distorted such that the commander-in-chief now exercises authority far beyond what the framers of the Constitution intended in the first place.
Do you have a grip on what the debate at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 was about concerning war powers, in which it said Congress shall declare war? Why it determined that?
I do not.
Yeah.
What I would say, though, and I believe I am historically correct here, is that the framers were intent on creating a federal structure of three co-equal branches of justice, and yet the first among equals, in their estimation, was the Congress itself. It is Article 1 of the Constitution that lays out the role of the Congress. It's Article 2 that turns to the presidency. And over time, we have come to a system where the president is the dominant figure. I'm always struck by the sense in which we have come to believe that basically nothing can happen unless the president says it's going to happen. And that if we have a president like Trump, who is himself a source of chaos, then nothing happens. I mean, there is ostensibly a bipartisan agreement, just to take one example, on an infrastructure program. That is to say, Democrats and Republicans agree that we have a rapidly deteriorating infrastructure in this country, and there's a need for an enormous amount of investment. I mean, how difficult can this be? But it doesn't happen because the president doesn't want it to happen. And I think that itself is an indicator of how warped our system has come to be and how far we have strayed from the intentions of the framers.
My understanding of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, where you get the declaration of war, is done by Congress, is that the framers were concerned about were concerned about previous European monarchies that used war for their own personal benefit, and then B, they even actually changed the words during the debate from Congress shall make war to Congress shall declare war, because in that change, declare rather than make gave the president at least some leeway to protect the country when under attack.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, what you just said, and it makes sense to me there needs to be an apportioning of authority on matters related to war. The optimum solution is not to create a situation where the president can do nothing and have to get permission from the Congress for any particular decision. But I would still argue that what we have has gone way too far in terms of allowing the president to exercise great latitude. And again, emphasizing, not simply this president, in my judgment, any president. It's a problem for us.
This drift towards an imperial presidency, if this is not checked, and let me ask you, do you think they're effectively trying to check it now, the Congress? And if it's not checked, I mean, could this even expand more so towards the president if not properly handled right now? I guess what I'm trying to get at is, in a way, do you think we're at a crossroads?
I think we were at a crossroads long ago. We just didn't recognize it. I mean, but yeah, if the president does something and then is not checked, then that action is precedent setting. As I understand the efforts in the Congress right now, first of all, they're directed at Trump, as opposed to directed at trying to rebalance the authority between the Congress and the presidency more broadly. And secondly, although I believe the resolution to insist that Trump may not attack Iran further without congressional authority, it passed in the House, and I don't even know if it's going to come to a vote in the Senate. That is to say, the Republicans in the House and the Senate don't share in recognizing that presidential war making is a problem. They are consumed by partisan analysis, and so, as far as they're concerned, Trump should have unchecked authority because he's a Republican and they're Republicans. I mean, that also is indicative of the political disarray that we are dealing with today.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with Andrew Bacevich, Professor Emeritus of History and International Relations at Boston University, also chair of the Quincy Institute for Intelligent Statecraft. He is the author of the book, The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory. Andrew Bacevich, I want to go back to something you said earlier, even recognizing what some of our listeners may be thinking when you talk about the difference during the Cold War and then after the Cold War. Again, going back to that quote from Gorbachev's aide saying, "We will deprive you now of an enemy." And you acknowledge that people are probably thinking, well, what about the Korean War? What about the Vietnam War? What about, you mentioned the CIA, what about the overthrows of Mossadegh in Iran, or the overthrow of a leader in Guatemala? I mean, are these any less significant than what we've seen post-Cold War?
Well, I'm not sure I'm persuasive, but the significance I'm trying to point out is one that relates to the overarching rationale. I'm not trying to diminish for a second the significance of wars like Korea or Vietnam. I'm not trying to diminish for a second the misuse of the CIA. But I do argue that those things happened in a context. And the larger context was that decision makers believed that these actions were necessary to prevent a much bigger war. Let's take Vietnam as an example. I mean, the Vietnam was reckless, was disastrous, a disaster owned by presidents beginning with Harry Truman, going up to Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. So why were we in Vietnam? How was the war sold to the American public? It was sold as necessary to prevent the spread of communism. The idea was, oh my gosh, if Vietnam falls, then so will the rest of Southeast Asia. then the communists will gain an enormous advantage in this contest with us to determine whether our system or their system will define the future of the world. Let me emphasize that analysis was deeply flawed. This whole notion that somehow our well-being and safety depended on the future of Vietnam was immensely wrong-headed. But nonetheless, the overarching rationale was to avert a much larger problem, a much more dangerous problem. That's not the logic that has applied since the end of the Cold War, in my judgment. Since the end of the Cold War, the logic is we can put American military power to work to solve problems. And I think that, in a sense, the perfect example, comparable to Vietnam, is the George W. Bush administration's decision to go to war in Iraq in 2003. We're going to invade a country. We're going to overthrow the government. We're going to install in Baghdad a new government that will be presumably pro-American, liberal in some way, stable. And it turned out to be a monumental catastrophe, really a catastrophe comparable to Vietnam, if not worse. So after the Cold War, we're not trying to avoid wars. After the Cold War, we're starting wars. And I think that is an important distinction that we need to recognize. In no way justifying the military policies of the Cold War itself.
It appears as though Donald Trump is more hesitant to actually get involved in a big war. Again, he ordered the assassination of Soleimani, but with something, say, on par of Afghanistan or Iraq. Would you agree with that?
In a way, it's hard to know what Trump we should take seriously. He is on record over and over and over again condemning our wars in the Middle East, our post 9/11 wars in the Middle East, denouncing them as the height of folly, and vowing that he, as president, will end our endless wars. I think that promise was at least one important factor contributing to his election in 2016. That the people who voted for him included those whose sons and daughters have been sent to fight these wars in the Middle East and who have therefore paid a heavy price. On the other hand, Trump is so unprincipled, so incapable of carrying out a strategy that would consist of, step 1 and then step 2 and then step 4 and all the way up to step 19. Instead, a guy who simply acts on impulse. He's shown absolutely no capacity to actually end our endless wars. And I think the assassination of Soleimani sort of illustrates that. What was the purpose of this? From what we know from press reports, apparently Pentagon planners came to him and said, we need to retaliate against the Iranians, and here's 5 options, numbered 1 through 5, and the 5th one, the most extreme, was the assassination, and that's why he chose. That's the one he chose, and why he chose it, with what expectation would follow. It's all a mystery.
Yeah, according to the New York Times, even surprised the advisors. Apparently, the Pentagon usually comes with really extreme measures to make the ones the Pentagon supports seem a little more palatable.
Absolutely, I think we have pretty good evidence of that. Again, not confined to this administration, but it's one option that's a little bit too hot and one that's a little bit too cold, and one of them's just right. And that's what they want. And they expect the president to sort of be gamed into choosing the one that's just right. And Trump simply didn't play along. And so we end up with what we've got.
Andrew Bacevich, how much power do you think Donald Trump has to end what we now call the endless wars. And I asked this thinking about a previous book that you wrote that we had you on a number of years ago called The Washington Consensus, in which you make this argument, and I think a correct argument, that there's this consensus, especially around foreign policy, especially around military policy around the world, that you get very little difference between Republican and Democratic presidents, that there's already this consensus that's kind of already driving the ship. It seems like Donald Trump has, if anything, upset that Washington consensus. So how much power do you think Donald Trump even has in all this?
Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind that the consensus to which you refer remains well in place. There's no doubt in my mind that Trump himself does not adhere to that consensus, does not believe, is not committed to that consensus. And I think that's why the foreign policy establishment is wary of him, the military, the intelligence community, the bureaucracy, because Trump doesn't believe what they believe with regard to America's role in the world, and particularly what the role of American military power. On the other hand, Trump has demonstrated no capacity to present a coherent alternative. He is against endless wars. What is he for? I mean, in the economic realm, we can tell what he's for. He's for changing the terms of trade between the United States and many of its principal trading partners. He thinks we've been screwed, and he thinks he can negotiate better deals. And he has followed through on that. Whether or not to the benefit of our country, I don't know, but he certainly has followed through. But when it comes to the role of military power, he has not presented really anything like a coherent alternative. You know, in that book you referred to, Washington Rules, I describe how the consensus forms. And one example would be that the national security establishment believes that it's incumbent upon the United States to maintain military forces scattered all around the world. We famously have something on the order of 800 bases. I can't remember in how many countries we have U.S. forces based. I believe it's somewhere in the order of 150. I mean, some in small contingents, some in big contingents. We still have tens of thousands of troops in Europe, 70 years after the end of World War II. So the national security establishment is committed to this notion that our security requires basing U.S. forces all around the world. If Trump were actually committed to ending endless wars, then Trump would have something to say about that. Not simply say about it. Trump would say, here is my plan for reducing the U.S. military presence abroad. He's given us no such plan. I mean, early on, Trump was adamant that NATO was obsolete, threatened to pull out of NATO, sharply criticized our allies for failing to contribute their fair share to the alliance, and did so with some reason. You know, the expectation is that NATO countries will all spend at least 2% of GDP on their military. Very few actually do, and Trump complained about that. But here we are toward the end of his first term, and the United States is still in NATO. The Europeans have not, in any particular way, increased their levels of defense spending. They've basically blown him off. And the notion that we're going to pull out of NATO has gone away. Indeed, Trump, in the aftermath of the Soleimani assassination, was calling on NATO to play a larger role in the conflicts in the Middle East. And my point here is that he is so inconsistent that I think it's fair to say there is no Trump national security policy. There are impulses and inclinations. There certainly is not anything that rises to the level of a strategy.
Andrew Bacevich, you were a Cold Warrior. You're a former retired Army colonel based in Europe, correct?
A lot of time, yeah, 7 years in Europe.
Yeah. What do you think about this impeachment attempt on Donald Trump? And the reason I frame it as to the Cold War, because there are critics to the impeachment, including on the left, who make an argument because this is about Ukraine, what this is really about is upsetting what we call that Washington consensus. And so you're getting these foreign diplomats coming out, testifying against the president. And what the president's really guilty of is, again, upsetting that Washington consensus when it comes to foreign policy.
I think there's something to that. Again, I want to make clear that Trump's the worst president we've ever had. He's a man of no principles. He lies. He's untrustworthy. He's erratic. He's narcissistic. Pick an adjective that we can apply. And I have no problem with the impeachment process, even though it's going to end in failure, because there's no sign that I can see that the Republicans are going to vote to convict. So the entire episode is going to be to no avail. If he's thrown out of office, I'm okay with that. Although then we have to remember that we get Mike Pence as president. I'm not sure that would be a significant improvement. But all of that said, I think to some degree, the impeachment process is really contrived. And here I don't want to stick up for the Republican Party, but there are Republicans or Trump supporters who say that progressives, generally speaking, Democrats, have never really accepted Donald Trump's election, have never viewed him as a legitimate president. I think that's true. And I think that Trump's sharpest critics have been looking for any way possible to terminate a presidency that they view as an affront to everything that is good and is decent. And the Ukraine escapade has handed them the weapon to try to do just that. In the ranking of stupid decisions made by presidents over the past 2 or 3 decades, I don't think that the Ukraine episode makes it into the top 10. I mean, if we compare it with things like the invasion of Iraq or the mismanagement of the Afghanistan war, revealed in detail by the Afghanistan papers published by the Washington Post, those, to my way of thinking, greatly exceed the Ukraine thing in seriousness. So yeah, let's see if we can get rid of them. But I think that if any anti-Trump person thinks that, if we can just get rid of Trump, everything is going to be okay, I think that person is deeply deluded. I argue that in my book. That the country is so deeply divided, divided over Trump, but divided over many other things. Military policy is one. Economic policy is another one. The cultural issues are another one. It's those divisions that put Trump in office, and it's those divisions that demand our attention if we're ever going to have a country that reunites and is able to take on the enormous challenges that we face. Let's take climate change as one example. I mean, if we are going to, and of course we have to do this not simply as a nation, we have to do this in collaboration with every other country on the planet. If we are ever going to seriously address the danger of climate change, we're going to have to change our way of life. And again, not just we Americans, we humanity, going to have to change our way of life in order to reduce carbon emissions. in order to address the problems related to the disappearance of species, in order to address the problem of the accumulation of plastic everywhere from the world's oceans to the food that you and I eat. So the challenges we face in the 21st century are enormous, and we can't blame them on Donald Trump, even though he, of course, makes things worse.
And even your previous point, just about the power that Congress has given up over years and the power that has been taken on through that by the presidency, for me, the big question has always been, what do things look like after this moment? What are the new precedents that are in place?
Well, I mean, I fear that a deepening political dysfunction is going to be one result. You know, I don't pretend to know how this Democratic race for the nomination is going to play itself out. I do have a hard time believing that, however it does, that the 2020 presidential election is going to close the divisions in our country and produce something like a unity and provide a mandate for action, not simply a mandate for presidential action, but a mandate for political action in which the president and the Congress can come together to address things like climate change. I just don't see how that's going to happen, even though that's the urgent need.
As we move to wrap up here, again, going back to things before the end of the Cold War and how things changed afterwards, I've heard an argument out there, not that we obviously should be in a Cold War. Well, let me ask you this first. Do you think we're entering back into a Cold War with Russia?
Well, I'm less concerned about Russia and the U.S.-Russia relations than I am U.S.-China relations. You know, Russia is certainly an adversary. Putin is a troublemaker. Putin will exploit any opportunity he can to embarrass or discomfit the United States, to enhance Russian power, for example, in the Middle East at our expense. But I think it's an enormous mistake to confuse Russia today with the Soviet Union of the 50s and 60s. Russia is not animated by any ideology that makes universal claims, as was the case with communism. Russian economy is backward. I believe that in terms of GDP, Russia is about the same size as Italy. They do make first-quality weapons, but besides that, I think that they are more of a nuisance than a threat. China is different. I mean, this is a dynamic country. It's huge in terms of its economy. It's huge in terms of its ambitions. And while I would push back against the notion that we are doomed to engage in a Cold War with China, or worse still, a hot war with China, I think it is the U.S.-China relationship and managing that and trying to keep that from becoming hostile. I think that's of far greater importance than the question of U.S.-Russia relations.
So thinking about the Cold War and the United States over that period of time domestically, I've heard it be argued that because you had an adversary, because the adversary was the Soviet Union that had a different ideology, one of communism, it actually forced, in a way, the United States to be better. That you had to have such things as, say, the New Deal in the 1930s, because of the economic situation and because you were trying to ward off the ideas of communism. That it somewhat helped propel even civil rights movements in a way and victories in a way, because you could always compare the United States to the Soviet Union. It was this competition of who's better.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think that I argue in the book that I don't celebrate the Cold War. I don't miss the Cold War. I think the Cold War was probably an unnecessary disaster that we, to some degree, imposed on ourselves. But I also think that the Cold War had kind of a disciplining effect that kept us from, preserved us from our demons to some degree. And when the Cold War went away and we decided that history had ended, when we decided that we were the sole superpower, the indispensable nation, when we decided that our system was destined to prevail everywhere, when we decided that globalization offered the key to making everybody rich, the result was a series of unintended consequences that end up bringing us to where we are today. A divided and confused country.
Yeah, I don't know if there is a direct connection here of cause and effect, but it is interesting, and I'm just thinking about it now, that you see this explosion really beginning of wealth inequality in this country with sort of the end of the Cold War.
Absolutely. There is a cause and effect in my judgment. I mean, it's with the end of the Cold War that this infatuation with globalization really takes off. I mean, but during the Cold War, American political leaders in both parties, were committed to free trade. But there was, I think, at that time, a livelier appreciation for equitability. In order for the Cold War to command political support, American people need to believe that they were invested in this country. I think much of that went away after the Cold War. And globalization, the support for globalization has produced all kinds of negative consequences, one of which is this incredible gap between the well-to-do and the not well-to-do.
Andrew Bacevich is Professor Emeritus of History and International Relations at Boston University. He is the chair of the Quincy Institute for Intelligent Statecraft. He's the author of a number of books. His latest is called The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory. Andrew Bacevich, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Mitch, thank you very much.
And that does it for Letters and Politics. The show is produced by Deanna Martinez. Kirsten Thomas is our engineer. You can find archives of our previous shows online at kpfa.org. I'm Mitch Jeserich, and I thank you for listening.
My stroke did not just change my life, it saved my life. So David Talbot begins his memoir, Between Heaven and Hell, the story of my stroke. Annie Lamott says the book is touching, informative, sometimes funny, sometimes harrowing. I could not put it down. I felt the same. David Talbot will appear in Berkeley on Wednesday, January 27th at the Hillside Club, 2286 Cedar Street. It's a KPFA benefit, wheelchair accessible. Quincy McCoy, KPFA's terrific manager, will be in conversation with Talbot. Conversation that promises to be tender, powerful, humorous, intimate, uncensored, pals talking. Tickets available online at brownpapertickets.com or at supportive indie bookstores. David Talbot, January 27th.
You're listening to 94.1 KPFA, 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, 97.5 K248BR in Santa Cruz, and online worldwide at kpfa.org.